Is Ted Cooley with the second lecture of this series. Last week, chapter 2 of The People's History stressed slavery and the beginnings of the racial problems. In chapter 3 today, the underclass situation is well described. This continues as a problem today. It is what brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis and continues in Reverend Dr. William Barber's Poor People Crusade. To quote Zen, the servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserably poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600s, the enclosing of the land for the production of wool, this filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them, unquote. Following the 45 Scottish uprising with Prince Charlie, the clearances in Scotland pushed many of the inhabitants, as well as Scottish prisoners, to be shipped to the New World. This mix with the slaves produced a citizen body with special tendencies. One of the characteristics of the Americans, and particularly the United States, is that, excluding those brought to the New World as slaves, the newcomers tended to be the more adventurous. Whether they walked across the Bering Bridge 15,000 years ago or came by ship later, there was an openness to change which was in common. Though there's not a one-to-one correlation between adventurous temperament and a tendency to violence, a positive relationship in these two aspects of personality is rather obvious. From the 1650s to the Revolutionary War, there were continuous, though intermittent, times of conflict within these colonies. The most famous of these is Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 in Virginia, which burned Jamestown and lasted for several months in that summer. Every segment of the Virginian society got into the act, with the poor free, indentured servants, slaves, Native Americans, and the British establishment all taking part, some groups at one time or another taking both sides. Already, there had developed an aristocracy in the tidewater of landed wealth. That year, a dry spring and summer caused a loss of corn for food for the inhabitants and tobacco for the coinage to pay the taxes. The settlers on the frontier wanted the natives to be pushed back further. The merchants in London controlled tobacco prices with a significant markup for their profit. And the taxes on the poor landowners were excessive in light of the profit of the London merchants, which was a fact known to those living in the colony. The governor was in his 70s and desiring retirement. Instructions from London, backed by the Virginia colonial government, seemed unreasonable. Finally, the colonial government was playing the native peoples and those on the frontier off against one another. This was the making of a perfect storm. Bacon died of natural causes. The rebellion collapsed, with slaves being returned to their masters, indentured servants being returned to their masters, some of the frontier settlers allowed to resume their lives, and the final resistance of slaves and free settlers were captured with the leaders hung. However, the tensions of natives on the frontier, unequal taxation as viewed by the working class, abuse of both slave and indentured by the masters, and the social prosperous retaining their privileges were not changed in any manner. The tensions were allowed to continue with smaller but serious actions of unrest. The whole 150 years before the revolution consisted of immigration, protests, separation of class on wealth, and a low level of unrest, though the documentation of this social tension is rather limited. As an illustration, my mother's sister, a librarian at Duke University and excellent researcher, found a relative paying taxes in Virginia about 1617. We have no knowledge of nation of origin, date of arrival in Virginia, or status of this person, as very few persons obtain property for tax purposes, and those who wrote usually constituted the landing class. A serious prejudice was applied by many of them to the underclass. True documentation, then, in the situation for this whole 150 years is difficult to obtain. This was further complicated by Parliament in 1717, starting the process of transporting convicts to the colonies. This practice continued for years, with Australia being the destination after the United States obtained independence. The increasing separation between the wealthy and the underclass was documented with 1687 and 1771 Boston tax records. In the first example, the top 1% of the population had 25% of the wealth. 84 years later, the top 1% had 44% of the wealth. This result of centralized wealth has a long history of resulting in social stress. From the time of the prophet Amos and the collapse of Israel before the Assyrian armies, to the collapse of the national regime and their forces in China in 1949. They all share this in common. The economic suppression of the underclass, indentured servants, poor farmers, slaves, all produced a situation ripe for revolution. The events of 1776 were not simply the desire of enlightened leaders to achieve freedom. They had deep roots in the economic inequality and the insensitivity of Parliament to the weakness of the economic and social situation in the New World. England itself avoided major revolution with the Corn Laws early in the next century, which had some effect in the leveling of the wealth and social status within Great Britain. Zen presents all these attempted and thwarted revolts in no logical manner, yet he provides overwhelming evidence of an unstable society protected by imported troops from England and the presence of the Navy to bring order to a colonial system with very serious social weaknesses. The wealthy in England were making a great profit from the labor of the New World. The few landed planters in the colonies were doing well. The rest of the society was being played off against each other in terms of economics, law, and slavery for the benefit of the few. The status of the poor, whether free or indentured, was often as bad or worse than those who had remained in England. Correspondence preserved from that time speaks of immigrants telling those still in England not to come, as those in the colonies, their situation had worsened. Some of this filtered back to the home country, so that some captains of immigrant ships locked up their signed immigrants until sailing in order to make certain that they would not change their minds. The lesson was well learned by the Southern planters, for playing the race card of poor white against black in order to maintain their own wealth and privilege was and has been the political and social means of control in many of the Southern states to this day. End of chapter 3, chapter 4. The 7 Years' War, ending in 1763, which we know in this country as the French and Indian War, caused two changes in the political situation without which the American Revolution might never have happened. First, it removed the French presence from the north and, as a related item, removed the French support of the tribes to the west of the British treaty line, which was developed at the end of the war, telling the settlers they could no longer move any further west, and a major source of irritation. Thus indicating to the pioneers on the west of the colonies that the limit to further movement to the west was no longer possible. Second, and possibly more important, the war cost the British government a lot of money. In the eyes of Parliament, a significant portion of the cost was the war in North America, so that the colonies should stand a significant part of this cost. Thus, tax policies were established to recover part of the expense of the war, as the expense included a lot of costs incurred in defending the colonies in North America. The removal of the French from their support of the natives made, in the mind of those on the frontier, the native populations weaker, as the French had supported the natives with arms and technology. The treaty line, as mentioned, was a particular irritant. It's up on the chart today as one of the major items, as the pioneers knew of good land to the west and desired to inhabit it. Should the British be removed, this significant impediment to a better life would be removed. Parliament saw the colonies as a source of income for the mother country, though the Declaration of Independence stresses the part of King George in the reasons for independence. The colonists had spent years trying to lobby Parliament into viewing the colonies as deserving of better treatment. It was the Parliament that really held the power at this time, despite the better propaganda worth of blaming the king in the Declaration of Independence. In the decade following the French and Indian War, the manufacturing and mercantile activity in the major cities of the colonies increased significantly. This was the beginning of what, in a later time and place, would be called a nation of shopkeepers, only a title of derision given to Britain while it was in a national emergency well in the future. The financial records of illegal trade with other countries, and through the means of smuggling, very profitable to the colonial merchants so engaged, was simply not recorded, as much as his activity was illegal. Nevertheless, this financial activity was a significant part of the economy. Zinn was aware of these two changes during the French and Indian War, but does not recognize the impact on the colonies. Hence, he does not dwell on either the impact of the French and Indian War or of the underground economy, which was an increasing source of wealth, particularly in the northern colonies. Rather, he continues to show correctly the split between the poorest of the colonists and the beginnings of the middle class, which was true. However, the influence of the middle class and the often illegal wealth of the new rich had a very successful propaganda effect in influencing the underclass in the direction of seeking independence. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act in response to protests from the colonies on other taxes to pay for this previous war. This may have been an error on the part of Parliament, as newspapers were included in this tax. With the widespread of the population in the colonies and a fairly decent literacy, this impacted many molders of public opinion in further opposition to Parliament and the king. Since the cost of the tax was attached to the newspaper, the printer felt damaged by the tax. As the cost of the final product fell to the consumer, he felt damaged. For most of the printers, this tax became an additional item of resistment and complaint. In 1766, several of the western counties in the North Carolina colony saw the development of a movement called the Regulators. This was almost a revolutionary movement against taxes, sheriffs, and the coastal-based British governing structure, which continued until 1771. This movement seems to be accurately portrayed in the fourth season of the series Outlander, set in the same time and location. New York had the largest Black population in the North, and here slaves were part of the mass mob-like demonstrations. Vermont, with the Green Mountain Boys, broke from New York at this time, becoming separate from the rest of the New York colony. All of this incipient violence was certainly unsettling. Throughout the northern colonies, agitation for some solution to economic and social crisis, both by the underclass and a lot of the developing middle class, increased the general social pressure. Boston increasingly became a center of the unrest. The Stamp Act protest resulted in violence against the homes of government officials. Then, when it was repealed, other taxes came to replace it. Samuel Adams and others of some wealth were pushing for protests, but were reluctant to turn the mob totally loose. Their attempts to get change, while using but not totally siding with the underclass, is well explained by Zinn. By 1770, the quartering of British troops at homes and the taking of jobs by these troops while not in uniform resulted in a riot over jobs lost due to the troops' presence. This resulted in shooting of the protesters in Boston in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The first person killed was a Black, though others also died. And the punishment of the soldiers firing without orders was considered by the Boston public to be far too minimal in light of the lives taken. By this time, various committees in the respective colonies were in contact with each other, trying to present a united front in their petitions and correspondence with Parliament. Most of the middle class still supported being under England as long as certain legal and tax programs could be reconciled. to the extent that the white underclass had any goals at all. It was for an economic leveling, where their work efforts received recognition and the extremes of the visible wealthy could be corrected. The use of the written word in sharing the ideas of the revolution may have been a first in the world. The committees of correspondence were part of the preparation for this change. The rather widespread of newspapers and literacy in the colonies was also a factor. Borrowing from English and other social writers earlier in the century was definitely a factor. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, gave a view of all men created equal, despite his shortcomings at the time of writing, as Zen laments. It has given the country a goal which is still in the process of being realized. Some of the other writings have also had far-reaching implications. The literary effort was enormous. Thomas Paine overall may have had the most interesting impact. He may have been the first professional revolutionary in the history of the world. His common sense was a vital factor in uniting many factions on the idea of independence. However, his life did not end there. After the American Revolution, he traveled to England to bring revolution there also. Failing, he escaped by boat to France, just ahead of the authorities, who tried him in absentia and found him guilty of sedition. In France, he played a significant role in the French Revolution with his Rights of Man pamphlet, which was a major literary factor in the French Revolution. In fact, he was such a radical that they denied bringing his remains back to the United States for burial, and over 20 years after the French Revolution, where some of the height of this feeling, even in the colonies against Paine, had the opportunity to die down. End of lecture.